If you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. When the channel reaches 1,000 subscribers, I'll share a surprise story I've prepared especially for you. The road to the frontier fort stretched dry and uneven across a barren plain. A single rider approached, his armor dulled by years of campaigns, his face marked by sun and fatigue. His name was Marcus Vero, a legionary who had marched under 3 generals and fought in more battles than he cared to remember. He had expected his career to continue in the same rhythm of blood and orders, but Rome had reassigned him, not to another battlefield, but to a remote posting far from the cities, a place that seemed forgotten by the Senate itself. He carried with him a soldier's discipline, yet beneath it a gnawing uncertainty. He knew how to face enemies, but not how to face silence. The fort rose ahead, its stone walls weathered and scarred by fire. The wooden gates creaked open with little ceremony, and Marcus stepped into the courtyard prepared to see soldiers drilling or stores of grain being tallied. Instead, he stopped short. The space was filled with children, dozens of them, some sitting on broken carts, others huddled near empty water jars. Their faces were pale, their eyes darting at the sight of another armored man. A few clung to scraps of cloth or bits of wood they treated like treasures. The air smelled of smoke and sickness, not of order or strength. A centurion, older and stooped, walked toward him. His armor hung loose, and his voice carried the exhaustion of a man who had seen his garrison reduced to something less than a unit. He explained without ceremony. A raid months earlier had left the fort scarred. Soldiers had died. Families in the nearby settlement had been slaughtered or scattered, and the surviving children had been brought inside these walls. Rome had not sent replacements, nor supplies. What remained of the garrison was a skeleton crew. Marcus, without choice, was now one of them. His orders were simple on paper, but heavy in reality. Help maintain the fort, and above all, keep the children alive. As Marcus listened, his eyes moved over the young faces. Some stared back with suspicion, others shrank behind older companions. He felt a sharp discomfort in his chest, different from the tension of battle. He had stood over dying comrades, watched legions break in panic, endured hunger on long marches. But none of that prepared him for the sight of these children, left without parents, looking at him as if he were both threat and hope. His instinct was to straighten his back, to appear firm, because he knew weakness would unsettle them further. But inside he felt unsteady, uncertain if he was capable of being what they needed. Among them, he noticed a woman standing apart, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She was not a child, not a soldier, but something in between, a civilian who had chosen not to leave. Her name, the centurion explained, was Livia. She had lived in the nearby settlement with her husband until the raid had taken him. With no family left and nowhere to go, she had remained inside the fort, helping when needed, though her presence was tolerated more than welcomed. Marcus caught the guarded look in her eyes, a silent judgment of every soldier who had failed to protect her home. As night fell, Marcus was given a small chamber and little instruction. He removed his armor slowly, setting it against the wall, aware that its weight meant nothing here. He sat on the bed, staring at the rough stone, thinking of how far he had traveled from the ordered lines of battle. His hand tightened around the hilt of his sword before he let it go. For the first time in years, the weapon felt useless. What lay ahead was not a campaign against enemies in formation, but something unfamiliar and unsettling. He wondered if Rome had forgotten this place entirely, or if the empire believed that hardened veterans like him could be reshaped into guardians of the weak. Lying awake, listening to the muffled sounds of children shifting in their sleep beyond the thin walls, Marcus realized his duty had changed. His orders were not to conquer, but to endure alongside those who could not protect themselves. The thought both frightened and steadied him. Fear because he doubted his ability to guide lives so fragile. Steadiness because at last he had no choice but to face a test that required more than strength. And so his posting began, not as a warrior at the edge of Rome's empire, but as an unprepared guardian in a fort filled with orphans and a grieving woman who did not yet trust him. The following morning, Marcus stepped into the courtyard as the first light spread over the walls. The air was cold, carrying the smell of damp ashes from fires that had burned through the night. Children were already stirring, some rubbing their eyes with dirty hands, others searching for food with quiet desperation. They looked to him as he passed, not with trust, but with wary calculation, the same way camp followers studied soldiers to guess if they were cruel or kind. He felt their stares weigh on him. He had commanded men in battle, but he had never held the attention of so many children at once. For the first time in years, his discipline did not provide clear answers. Livia stood near the well, drawing water with steady hands. Her face was sharp with sleeplessness, her hair tied back with a strip of worn cloth. She glanced at Marcus briefly before turning her eyes away, her expression flat and unreadable. The centurion had said she remained because she had nowhere else to go, but Marcus understood there was more to it. She was the only adult among the children, a figure they leaned on even as she carried her own grief. He saw the way the smallest ones pressed against her skirt, how the older ones followed her movements as if waiting for instructions. She had become, in the absence of their parents, their anchor. The children's survival raised immediate questions, and Marcus wanted answers. He approached the centurion again and asked why Rome had not collected the orphans, or why they were not sent to a larger settlement. The centurion explained what Marcus had suspected but not wanted to hear. No wagons had come since the raid, and no orders had followed. The empire's focus was elsewhere. Supplies were scarce, and the soldiers were too few to guard the roads. Abandoning the children would have been dishonor, so they had been left inside the fort. Marcus felt a bitterness rise in him, the familiar weight of serving a state that demanded loyalty but rarely returned it. Still, he accepted that he now carried responsibility not just for the walls but for the lives within them. He turned back to Livia, deciding he could not remain silent if he hoped to be of use. He told her plainly that his orders placed him among them, that he would not shirk his part. She listened without expression, her arms folded across her chest. When she finally spoke, her words were blunt. She said she had seen soldiers march through her village, promising protection, only to be absent when the raid came. Her husband had fallen defending their home, not under a Roman standard, but with a farming tool in his hands. She did not care for soldiers who arrived after the fact, when the damage was already done. Her words cut deep, but Marcus did not argue. He knew there was no defense. He had seen villages burn before, their people left broken by delays and poor commands. He had been part of campaigns that crushed enemies, yet left innocent lives in ruin. Standing before Livia now, he felt the weight of her judgment and understood it came not only from grief, but from hard truth. All he could answer was that he had not been there when the raid struck, but he was here now, and he would not abandon them. The days that followed forced Marcus to adjust. He organized the children in small groups to gather wood, fetch water, and sweep the courtyard, small tasks that gave them rhythm and kept fear at bay. His instructions were clear but not harsh, and he watched carefully to avoid the tone of command he once used with soldiers. The children responded slowly, uncertain at first, but they obeyed more readily when they saw he did not raise his hand against them. At night, when they huddled around the fire, he kept his distance but remained within sight, understanding that his presence reassured even when they mistrusted him. Livia observed all of this, her expression still guarded. Yet when one of the younger children stumbled carrying a bucket, Marcus bent down and steadied it with his hand instead of scolding. Livia noticed the quiet patience in the gesture. She did not speak of it, but something in her look shifted, a flicker of recognition that perhaps he was not like the others she had condemned. Inside, Marcus wrestled with doubt. He wondered if he could truly protect them if another raid came, if his strength would be enough when supplies ran thin. He thought of Rome, of how distant its senators were, of how forgotten this place had become. Fear lingered in him, not of death, which he had long grown used to, but of failing the children who had no one else. Yet each night, when he heard their quiet breathing from the other side of the walls, he felt his resolve strengthen. He had survived campaigns that seemed endless, but here was a duty that asked something greater, Not just endurance, but care. By the end of the week, the fort felt different. Still broken, still scarred, but no longer silent. Children's voices echoed between the stones, and fires burned more steadily. Marcus had not won trust, not yet, but he had carved out order where there had been only fear. And though Livia still watched him with suspicion, she no longer turned away when their eyes met. It was not acceptance, but it was the beginning of something that might one day hold. Winter arrived earlier than expected. Cold winds swept across the plain and pressed against the stone walls, slipping through the cracks of the fort like sharp knives. The children shivered even near the fire, their clothes thin and worn from months without replacement. Marcus knew the stores of grain would not last if they were careless, so he tightened the rationing and made sure water was fetched before the well froze. He had marched through winters on campaign, surviving on hard bread and discipline, but this was different here. Fragile lives depended on every choice he made. The children's survival raised new questions that Marcus could no longer ignore. Where did their food come from, and what would happen when it ran out? He asked the centurion, who admitted that only a small supply train had arrived since the raid. Rome had not sent reinforcements, and no word had come from the nearest city. They were alone. Marcus absorbed this in silence, the knowledge pressing on him harder than any order from a general. The empire had moved on, leaving the fort and its orphans as little more than an afterthought. It explained why discipline among the few soldiers had grown lax, why morale sagged. Now he understood that the garrison's real function was not to fight pitched battles, but to keep life within the walls from collapsing completely. Livia's role grew clearer as the nights grew colder. Though she carried grief heavily, she managed the children with a steadiness Marcus respected. She taught them how to sew torn cloaks with scraps of leather, how to keep the fire fed with smaller sticks to make what last longer, and how to comfort the little ones when nightmares returned. The children leaned on her not because of authority, but because she was the only familiar warmth left from their old lives. Yet Marcus could see how much weight she carried. In private moments, she often sat in silence, staring at the flames, her face tight as if she fought against breaking down in front of them. One evening, Marcus found her alone in the storeroom, trying to lift a sack of grain that was too heavy. Without a word, he moved beside her, taking the load in his arms. She stiffened, clearly not wanting to rely on him, but she did not stop him either. He placed the sack where she needed it and stepped back. She finally broke the silence with a sharp tone, asking why Rome had sent another soldier when what they truly needed was food and healers. He could not answer her with certainty, but he told her honestly that he was not here by choice either. Rome gave orders, and men like him followed. Yet, he added, since he was here, he intended to do what he could to keep them alive. The words were plain, but they were all he had. His honesty left her quiet. She returned to her work, but for the first time, she did not turn her back fully against him. It was a small shift, but he noticed. As the cold deepened, Marcus began taking long watches on the walls at night. The children sometimes woke and found him standing above them, wrapped in his cloak, silent but watchful. They started to believe, slowly, that he would not leave them. The older boys began to imitate his posture, trying to stand straight when he passed. The younger ones dared to approach him with questions about his sword, about his armor, about Rome. He answered simply, never boasting, but explaining enough to satisfy their curiosity. This small trust mattered. It gave him reason to continue, even when exhaustion pressed against him. Inside, Marcus struggled with his own doubts. He thought of his past campaigns, of comrades lost, of orders that had often felt meaningless. Here, every act, splitting a loaf of bread, mending a gate, teaching a child how to carry wood, had weight. He feared failing them not because of glory, but because failure would mean hunger, sickness, or worse. Yet he also began to feel something he had not known in years, purpose that was not tied to killing. By the end of that first winter, the fort had not grown stronger in numbers, but it had endured. Fires burned each night. The children's voices rose in the courtyard even on the coldest days, and though mistrust still lingered, it was thinner now. Livia's eyes softened at times when she caught Marcus steadying a child or offering his own portion of food without hesitation. She said nothing, but her silence carried less bitterness than before. The fort was no longer just stone walls. It was becoming something fragile but real, a place where survival was shared, and where Marcus and Livia, though still distant, were slowly bound together by the same unspoken responsibility. The thaw of spring brought no peace. Snow melted into mud around the walls, and the plains beyond the fort stretched bare, offering no cover for those inside to hunt or gather. Supplies remained scarce, and though the children had grown used to rations, hunger gnawed at them each evening. Marcus had begun to teach the older boys to stand guard in shifts, more as a lesson in discipline than true defense. But he knew it was only a matter of time before raiders tested the fort again. Rome had not sent reinforcements, and no messenger had arrived with news. They were alone, and every adult in the fort knew it. The attack came at dusk on a cold evening. Horns sounded across the plain, sharp and sudden, echoing against the stones. The children froze where they stood, eyes wide, some dropping their bowls of thin stew. Marcus's training returned instantly. He ordered the children to gather inside the main hall, his voice firm but not panicked, making sure they believed he was in control. The centurion and the few remaining soldiers scrambled to the walls, but their numbers were thin. Livia moved among the children, guiding the smallest ones, keeping her voice steady even as fear tightened her face. Questions the children had asked in the winter, who would protect them if danger came, whether Rome still remembered them, were now answered not in words but in action. Marcus climbed the wall, spear in hand, scanning the shadows of men approaching with torches and rough weapons. The raiders were fewer than he had once faced in war, but against such a weakened garrison, they were a true threat. He directed the soldiers to hold their ground, then turned to the older boys who had trained under his watch. He placed stones in their hands and told them to aim for the torches, to blind and scatter rather than kill. The boys hesitated, their hands trembling, but Marcus's steady tone anchored them. The first clash rattled the gates. Spears struck wood, and shouts filled the air. The children inside cried out, but Livia hushed them with calm, telling them Marcus was on the wall and that he would not let the raiders through. Her words carried weight, because though she had not trusted him fully before, in this moment she chose to speak as if she did. The defense was quick and brutal. Stones rained down from the boys' hands, forcing raiders back. Marcus and the centurion drove their spears between the gaps of the gate, wounding enough to break the assault's momentum. When the raiders realized the fort would not fall easily, they retreated into the dark. The clash lasted less than an hour, but for those inside it felt longer than a full night. When the horns faded, Marcus descended from the wall, sweat and mud on his face. The children swarmed him with questions. Were the raiders gone? Would they return? Had anyone died? He answered plainly. The raiders were beaten back. They would think twice before returning soon, and no child had been harmed. His words carried truth and steadiness, and for the first time the children's fear gave way to a fragile sense of pride. They had been part of the defense, not just helpless victims. Livia stood nearby, watching him. She saw the way he crouched to speak to the smallest ones, how he did not boast of victory or bark orders, but spoke with calm patience. Her own heart still carried grief, but in that moment she understood that his silence was not emptiness. It was discipline held in place for the sake of others. Later, when she handed him a cup of water by the fire, she did not avert her eyes as before. She met his gaze and gave a small nod, the first true sign of trust between them. That night the fort felt different. The walls were still cracked, food still short, Rome still distant, but there was a sense that they could endure together. Marcus lay awake, the sounds of sleeping children around him, and for the first time since his arrival, he did not wonder whether Rome would send help. He realized it no longer mattered. What mattered was that they had held, that no child had been lost, and that Livia had stood beside him. The questions of survival, trust, and purpose that had weighed on him since his arrival were not fully answered. But for the first time, he believed the answers could be found here. The days after the raid settled into a rhythm that felt different from before. The children no longer whispered fears each night, and some even boasted softly of how they had stood on the walls with stones in their hands. Marcus noticed the change. Their eyes carried less helplessness, more certainty that the fort could be defended. For him, the victory was not in driving the raiders away, but in the fact that the children had seen with their own eyes that they were not abandoned. Still, questions lingered. What would happen if a larger band returned, or if Rome continued to ignore them? These doubts pressed on Marcus each time he walked the perimeter of the wall, yet he chose not to voice them. The children needed confidence, not the weight of his worries. Livia's manner toward him shifted subtly after the defense. She no longer met his gaze with suspicion, but with quiet acknowledgement. One evening, as they repaired a section of the wall together, she asked him about his past campaigns. The question surprised him. Until then, she had avoided all mention of his life as a soldier. He answered carefully, describing not victories or glory, but the long marches, the hunger, the exhaustion, and the comrades lost. He admitted that he had begun to wonder, years ago, whether Rome cared for the lives it spent so freely. Livia listened closely, and for the first time, she spoke of her husband. She described him not as a warrior, but as a man who had worked the soil, who had dreamed of giving their children a safe life. Her voice trembled, yet she did not break. Marcus did not try to comfort her with empty words. He only listened, and in his silence, she found space to release the grief she had carried in silence. The children, too, began to see them as a pair of leaders. When disputes broke out, Marcus settled them with fairness, while Livius softened his decisions with understanding. He taught the older ones discipline, how to march in a line, how to carry loads evenly, how to hold a spear without fear, while Livia reminded them not to lose their laughter, telling stories of festivals from the village that no longer stood. Together, they balanced each other. One provided structure, the other warmth. The children began to call on both of them rather than one or the other, and this bond did not go unnoticed among the soldiers who remained. Yet gaps from the past still demanded answers. Marcus asked the centurion once more why no messengers had gone to Rome. The truth was plain. The garrison had too few men to spare for the dangerous journey, and after the raid, they could not risk leaving the children unguarded. Rome might not even respond if word reached them. The explanation confirmed what Marcus already suspected. They were on their own, and help would not come. Instead of discouraging him, it clarified his path. His loyalty no longer rested with distant commanders, but with the lives around him. The coming months tested them in smaller, more human ways. Illness swept through the fort, leaving several children weak. Marcus fetched herbs under Livia's direction, carrying back bundles from beyond the walls while she prepared remedies. He held fever-shaken boys upright while she spooned broth into their mouths. These nights of care revealed another side of both of them. Her determination even in sorrow, his patience even when exhausted. It was not spoken aloud, but each began to rely on the other more fully. By the time summer arrived, the fort had changed. The children had grown lean but stronger, their laughter returning in bursts as they played in the courtyard. The soldiers, though few, looked to Marcus not only as another legionary, but as a figure who steadied the fort with his presence. Livia, once silent in judgment, now sat beside him at the fire without hesitation, mending his cloak or sharing her portion of bread when his plate was empty. Trust had not been declared, but it was there, woven into every unspoken gesture. One evening, as the sun dropped low and cast long light across the stones, Marcus walked the walls with Livia at his side. She asked him directly what he would do if Rome finally sent orders to leave. He paused before answering, the question sharp and unavoidable. He admitted that once, he would have obeyed without hesitation. But now, looking down at the children running in the courtyard, he said quietly that he would stay. Children's voices carried over the courtyard, their laughter clear in the stillness, a sound Marcus had not expected to hear in such a place when he first arrived. Months had passed since the last raid, And though he never allowed the garrison to grow careless, he began to believe the enemy had moved on to easier prey. The children were no longer only survivors. They had become a community, and Marcus, once only a soldier, now moved among them as something more permanent. Questions that lingered from the beginning were slowly resolved. Would Rome send for them? No messenger had come, and by now the truth was clear. The empire had forgotten this post. Marcus accepted it without bitterness. He had lived long enough as a man obeying orders. Now his life had found meaning not through command but through choice. The centurion, once a strict overseer, had grown old and weary, and in practice Marcus had taken responsibility for the fort. The soldiers, few though they were, followed his guidance without argument. He carried the role not as a burden, but as a decision. This place was his to protect. The children, who had once looked at him with fear, now ran to him freely. They tugged at his cloak, asked him to settle disputes, and even laughed when he pretended to be stern. He began to see them not as wards of Rome, but as sons and daughters in all but blood. This realization unsettled him at first. He had never thought of himself as a father, never allowed himself to imagine life beyond campaigns. Yet each day it grew clearer that his duty had shifted. What Rome abandoned, he had chosen to claim as his own. Livia's presence had changed as well. Where once she had been cold and distrustful, she now moved beside him without hesitation. She worked with him on every task, mending walls, dividing food, tending to the sick, and in their shared labor trust had deepened into something stronger. She no longer spoke of leaving, nor of Rome's failures, and Marcus no longer tried to defend the empire he once served. Instead, they spoke of what the children needed next season, of planting small gardens near the fort, of how to prepare for another winter. These conversations were practical, yet beneath them was a bond that neither had named but both understood. One evening, as the sky turned red with the setting sun, Marcus called the children and soldiers together in the courtyard. He stood before them, not in armor, but in a simple cloak, the sword at his side, more symbol than weapon. He told them plainly, Rome had given no orders, and none would come. But the fort was no longer Rome's to abandon. It belonged to them now. They would remain, not as exiles, but as a family. His words carried weight, and the children's cheers rose into the air, their voices echoing off the stone. For the first time, Marcus felt the walls no longer hemmed him in. They protected something worth guarding. Later that night, after the fires burned low and the children had drifted to sleep, Marcus sat with Livia by the gate. She asked him if he truly meant to stay, even if years passed and Rome never remembered them. He answered without hesitation. He had fought long enough for causes he did not believe in. Here, for the first time, he fought for something he chose. Livia listened, her eyes steady on his, and after a long silence, she placed her hand over his. No words were exchanged, but none were needed. Their decision was the same. The fort no longer felt like exile. It was a place where grief had softened, where fear had given way to trust, and where two weary souls had built something lasting from what once seemed broken. Marcus rose the next morning not as a soldier awaiting orders, but as a man who had found his place. The children ran to meet him, their laughter rising in the clear air, and Livia walked at his side. The story of the forgotten fort ended not with ruin, but with renewal, a family bound not by blood or empire, but by choice, endurance, and the simple decision to stay.